Hello, everyone. Today I will be talking to you about ethical issues and research. Through this lecture, I will be summarizing the general concept of ethics and how ethics relates to social work research. I will be describing and going over the historical examples of research participant abuse and how those relate to current ethical principles. I will also be identifying the steps involved in utilizing an institutional review board, and I will be examining the standards for protection of research participants, and I will be interpreting the current ethical issues involved in social work research. So what are ethics? Ethics refer to principles within a society that reflect what the society views as right or wrong behavior. So in the case of research, we will be looking at the ethics or principles related to what we consider right or wrong behavior when conducting social work research. So let's go over some historical examples of participant abuse and how those cases help develop ethical principles in the area of research. So first, during World War II, heinous and repugnant medical experiments were conducted at Nazi concentration camps and Japanese prisoner of war camps, and people were deliberately exposed to diseases. They were deliberately wounded. They were exposed to extreme cold temperatures and placed in decompression chambers to study the effects of lack of oxygen. So as you can see, these examples are extreme, but this is what led to the ethical principle that research participation must be voluntary, whether it involves a prisoner of war, prisoner convicted of illegal activity, or other vulnerable populations. Another great example is the Tuskegee public health studies. So in this example, this study began to learn more about the long-term effect of syphilis in Tuskegee, Alabama, and African-American men participated in the study, some with syphilis and others did not have syphilis. What happened in this study is that research participants were not treated with penicillin so that researchers could continue studying the effects of untreated disease. And what happened is because they didn't, as a result of not receiving a treatment, is that they suffered from skin disorders, insanity, heart disease, and death. And this study went on for 25 years. So even though maybe the results were influential, were important, it was unethical because they allowed these men to suffer because they didn't receive any treatment, even though penicillin was available. So this study led to the ethical principle of no unnecessary pain and suffering. A third study is called the Milgram Studies of Obedience and Authority. So in this study, Stanley Milgram designed this study to learn more about the phenomenon of human obedience to authority, because he hoped to learn what people would do if an authority figure told them to do something they would never do. So in this case, he asked participants to administer high voltage shocks to their research partner for answering questions incorrectly. And participants were led to believe that these shocks were extremely painful and could possibly be harming their partners. So the participants, as you can imagine, were emotionally upset, and they asked and begged for the study to stop because they believed that their partners were actually being shocked. So what this study led us to the principles of, well, first, it helped us formulate the question, does a researcher ever have the right to leave research participants in worse physical or emotional condition than they started? So again, there are different issues, deception. We need to protect participants involved, and they have the right to withdraw at any time. Another well-known study is known as the Stanford Prison Experiment. And as part of the study, they examined the psychological impacts of prison life. They treated or they created a mock prison with 24 college students. And after only a few days, about 1/3 of the participants who were doing the role of guards, they started to adopt abusive behaviors. The study was scheduled to last 2 weeks, but it was discontinued only after 6 days because, as you can imagine, it was criticized because of the fact that research participants were affected by their experiences if the study would go on for a longer period. So again, for this, also we're looking at issues and ethical principles of right to withdraw, informed consent, because the participants were decepted and they needed debriefing after the study. And again, we need to ensure that our participants are protected from harm. In another study known as the Ladd-Humphrey studies of homosexual behavior, in this study, the researcher wanted to look at casual homosexual acts between strangers who led otherwise heterosexual lives. He frequented public restrooms, gaining the trust of men he wanted to observe. And he acted as a lookout for others so that he could observe their sexual activities. And he found that participants home through their license tag numbers, and he went to their homes and conducted a survey in order to gain additional demographic information from participants. So as also you can see in this study had also several ethical issues, including the right to privacy because, and also deception, because he pretended to be looking out for the men, but when in reality he was observing their behavior in the public restrooms as part of his study. So do you think they would have consent to participate in the study if they would have known? So their participation was involuntary, again, because he followed them to their house and he did a survey with them. But again, they were decepted and they didn't know that he was observing them in the bathrooms as part of the study. So, so finally, the Willowbrooks, I'm sorry. There, so the Willowbrooks hepatitis study, it was conducted in a residential facility that housed 6,000 children with cognitive disabilities. So these children were given protective antibodies and others were not. And the purpose of the study was to compare the levels of the two groups of their immunity. So the newly admitted children were given experimental protective antibodies, and then the other half were purposely exposed to the hepatitis virus, and the other half were not. So again, as you can see, some ethical issues were raised here because some argue that again, even though some ethical issues were brought up, some still argue that the benefits of research conclusion gained by these studies outweighed the harm done to research participants, and others argue that the students and parents were not informed of the risks of the study. So in this study, again, their participation had not been voluntary, so they didn't do a proper informed consent. So again, we need to look for these issues even in current research today. So as a result of those cases, again, those ethical research principles were developed, and not just the principles, but also organizations within different institutions that are in charge of reviewing and approving the different research studies by a team of researchers and other concerned parties. So for example, at New Mexico State University, we have an institutional review board. So before we are able to conduct any research studies as professors, we have to do an application or a proposal that has to be reviewed and approved by the Institutional Review Board, or IRB. And again, the purpose of these is that so that they can review and be able to identify any potential ethical issues that may arise from our studies. And as part of the city training that you are currently doing, any researcher, including professor or student or graduate assistant, we're all required to have that training done before being able to conduct research. So federal regulations, because this is regulated federally and not just by NMSU, they have divided human subject research into 3 categories. One is exempt. So these are studies that pose little or no risk to the research participants. Expedited, these are studies that collect data that is not anonymous, but involves only minimal risk to participants. Or full committee review, these are studies that pose more than minimal risks to participants. So for example, over the last year and a half, together with a colleague from the School of Social Work, we have been conducting a study on examining or exploring the barriers and facilitators of to service access among the immigrant population in Doña Ana County. So the category that the study fell into was exempt review, because it wasn't considered exempt because we were conducting interviews among different individuals, including leaders of different community agencies, and then also leaders of different government agencies. So because the study wasn't anonymous, anonymous means well, we could follow up with them. When we published the research, we would not reveal their identities, but we still had their names and contact information saved in our databases in case we wanted to follow up with them. So that's why it was not considered exempt. But it didn't require a full committee review for several reasons. We were not dealing with a vulnerable population, so we were not interviewing immigrant families directly. And the population that we were interviewing, again, included government and community agency leaders. They're not considered vulnerable populations. So when an IRB or an institutional review board reviews a research proposal, they look at different ethical principles to ensure that those are taken into consideration as part of the proposal and that we are protecting our human subjects. So one of the ethical principles is voluntary informed consent. So what does that mean? It means the participants are participating by choice. They're not being intimidated or coerced, and that we're not promising rewards. We can still provide a gift card in a small amount. So for example, we provided a $30 gift card, but we cannot provide, for example, oh, we're gonna provide you an $1,000 award. That would be considered coercion. As part of this ethical principle, participants must also be informed, so they must have all the information in order to make the decision whether or not to participate. So, and then also, those consents must be clear, and participants must understand what they're agreeing to participate in. So it is really important that consent forms be provided in the participants' native language, and that we also include cultural aspects that should be addressed. So for example, right now we're gonna be interviewing immigrant families, so we need to ensure that all of our materials that describe the study are in Spanish, because that's the population that we are gonna be targeting. Again, we need to be sensitive to the culturally determined patterns of authority. So for example, we need to ensure that the participants don't feel obligated to participate and that they feel that they have a choice. So in this case, if a figure of authority is asking them to participate, they may feel obligated, they feel that they have little choice but to participate. Also, voluntary informed consent, when we think about children or individuals who have a mental disability, we need to make sure that a parent, a guardian, a social worker, or other helping professional, they should advocate and sign for them. An example of these are, for example, again, if you are a social worker and you ask your client, oh, you need to participate in this study that I will be conducting, that would be unethical because your client would feel obligated to participate. The other ethical principle is called the no unnecessary pain and suffering. So an example of this would, again, we already provided some historical example, but some more contemporary examples would be that a study that would involve interviewing adult victims of child abuse So they're being asked to talk about a very traumatic experience, and this can be very painful. So again, we need to be sensitive, and if we are asking them to talk about this experience, we need to ensure, for example, that they have access to therapy and ensure that they have the necessary support for them to talk about their experience. Another example would be if we are doing a study on people who are taking antipsychotic drugs. So if we are asking participants to abruptly discontinue their medication, they will have a relapse, and we would be asking them to go through an unnecessary pain and suffering, because again, we don't know what the consequences would be by not having their medication. The other principle, ethical principles are anonymity and confidentiality. So anonymity is when the participant's identity is not connected to data in any way. So even the researchers does not know the identity. And confidentiality is different because participants' identity is connected to data. So researcher is ethically obligated not to reveal the participant's identity or to let others be able to associate the data with one participant. So an example of anonymity would be if we mail a questionnaire survey that does not use any case numbers or identifications on the questionnaires or on the return envelope. So the researchers would not be able to do any follow-ups at all. And the disadvantage of this would be, for example, again, so if the researcher wants to do a follow-up questionnaire, they would not be able to do so, but again, it would be protecting the client. And again, so if you still ask for some of the client's information, but you protect their information in a safe space, for example, in a computer that is password protected, or in a database, again, that is encrypted and data protected, that would still be considered ethical because, again, you're not revealing the participants' information. The fourth principle is called need to conduct research. So in this case, so research participants have the right to assume that whatever demands are made on them related to cost or time are necessary for the advancement of knowledge. So again, research studies cannot be ethically justified if they're merely provided as a learning experience for the researcher. They do not promise to advance knowledge, and they provide knowledge that is simply not worth knowing. And here are some contemporary issues related to research participants. So one of them is, are research volunteers truly voluntary? So if the researcher knows that the participant would probably choose not to participate if his or her situation were different, can the participant ethically be considered a volunteer? Here are some situations that cause us to question this ethical principle. So for example, when participants have little to lose, so for example, if they have already been So if they have been diagnosed with a terminal disease, for example, and they're being asked to participate in a study that requires them to take a treatment, they may feel that they have little to lose. Also, when even like small rewards can provide us strong incentives to participate in the study. So, if, for example, if people from low socioeconomic backgrounds, if they feel that the incentives are too strong, for example, if the incentive, monetary incentive is high, they may participate even if they don't want to. So when they agree to participate in something, they would not agree in a different circumstance. That's also, again, an example of that. So a dual role relationship exists, and this is similar again to the situations that you may encounter in your practice. So for example, if the researcher has any type of existing relationship with the potential research participants before they are asked to participate. So when dual relationships exist, certain precautions must be taken. So for example, we need to ensure that participants will not suffer a loss or disadvantage, and that pre-existing relationship should not be damaged, and counseling should be available if needed. So again, if you ask your clients to participate in return of, for example, free counseling, that may be a dual relationship, and then we may also question whether they're truly a voluntary participant. Other questions include, is it ethical in research studies to withhold treatment or use a placebo in order to create a control group for comparison purposes? So while some may argue that it is unethical to deny people experimental drugs or treatments by placing them in a control groups, others argue that such experimental interventions are necessary and that people have the right to participate in such experimental research. And other ethical obligations that we have as researchers include honestly reporting our findings. So again, not misleading people and falsely or making false claims. Again, so function with neutrality and objectivity. So we, even though, again, it's impossible to be full objective, we need to ensure that we include different ways of improving this neutrality or objectivity. So for example, when we conducted the study on immigrant families, we included different, we had community advisory group, and we also had a group of community agency partners who were part of our analysis to ensure that we were interpreting the data correctly. So we need to also resist outside influences, avoid conflicts of interest, you know, as a result of our funding, for example. We need to be aware of the tentative nature of scientific knowledge. And we should not take credit for the work of others. So in our team, we always give credit even to our graduate assistants. And we need to be concerned about the use and dissemination of our research findings. Again, so thank you so much. I hope this lecture was helpful to you this week. This is again part of the lecture on ethics that will be helpful to you also as you do your critique of the articles, because you need to look to see if they are taking some of the ethical principles into consideration when they conducted their research.